Welcome to Prepare to Practice 2016, Lexis's virtual version of our professional certification. My name is Heather Caro, and I'm your Lexis account executive. The purpose of this virtual training is to get you Lexis certified and ready to practice. And so, how are we going to do that? And so, these are the steps that you'll have to follow to complete your certification. So, the first thing is watching this virtual training and then sending me an email to confirm that you have indeed watched it, and that will earn you 400 Lexis Rewards points. After that, you'll receive another email with a link to a drafting specific video that once you watch it and complete the short quiz at the end of it, will send you another link with the certification exam. Once you complete that exam, you have 3 chances to get an 8 out of 10 to pass it. That will then give you a link that you can add this Lexis Professional Certification to your resume or your LinkedIn profile. All right, and so to make sure that you're ready to practice, last summer, Lexis surveyed over 2,500 law students regarding their summer jobs. And through the survey, we essentially identified the 3 most common types of research assignments that are given to summer interns, new associates, or law clerks. And so the goal of today's training is to focus on what's relevant to your summer and practical success. And so these are the areas that were identified. First, writing a memo on an unfamiliar topic or area of law. Second, researching statutes and regulations. And third, drafting motions and pleadings. So the hypo that we're going to walk through, I actually emailed to you guys, but just to quickly overview what that hypo was. It is a college professor came to your law office and essentially he was seeking representation in a case against the school that he worked for. He was recently suspended after he lost his temper in class and chastised 2 students for being unprepared. The professor then claimed that his communication difficulties were in due part to his Asperger's syndrome and that the administrators violated the Americans with Disabilities Act when they declined to accommodate his disability by ignoring his request for school-appointed mental health professionals. And so if that was the assignment that you were given this summer and you needed to conduct thorough research on this topic to help determine if your firm wanted to take on this case or not, where would you go? And so that is what this training is going to focus on. And essentially, it is the focus of the certification quiz at the end of this entire process. I am actually going to hand over the training to one of my colleagues, Bianca White, and she's going to walk you through this entire training that goes along with the handout that I've sent to you guys in the email with the link for this video. But before I hand it over to her, I did want to mention all of the support options that you guys do have. So remember that you have the live support chat feature located under the More drop-down menu on your Lexis account. You can also call the 1-800-45-LEXIS number. That's available 24/7 and it's free, both in law school and in practice to use. And of course, you can always contact me or your fellow student reps, and you can find all of that contact information on the law school homepage. And so now I'm going to hand it over to Bianca, and she is going to walk you through the research for the hypo that we just went through.
So we're going to go ahead and get started. Particularly when you have an act, it's a good idea to go ahead and start with the name of the act. So we're going to say Americans with Disability. We have sources that pop up, but also documents. And we want to grab the document and run the search there because that's going to pull us up the actual act. When you pull up a statute by an act, it's going to pull up the public law because the Americans with Disability Act is actually made up of multiple statutes. So it's technically more precise to take you through the public law that includes all of those statutes rather than a single portion of that act. But for our purposes, we want to search everything. So what we do is we click here to say View References to Americans with Disability Act. And what that's going to do is change our search from the public law to running the search for that actual phrase, Americans with Disability Act. And we're first going to start in statutes and legislation. As a general rule, we start in secondary sources when we're beginning a new research topic. But when you have a statute, you can always actually just go ahead and jump into the statute, and we'll talk about a couple of reasons why as we get a little deeper into this session. Once we come to statutes and legislation here, we want to apply a couple of other filters. The first one we would want to apply is codes. If you notice, this results list under statutes and legislation is made up of all of this material. And we actually only care about codified statutes signed off by the president or governor, respectively. So we'd want to go ahead and narrow it down to codes. The next filter that we would want to apply is jurisdiction. And kind of for the same reason, is we only care about statutes from a very precise jurisdiction. So in our case, we're looking for a federal statute, but if we were looking for a Tennessee statute, we would narrow down that way as well. And we won't apply it because we're getting all federal statutes at the top of the results list anyways. The default for how these are sorted is by relevance. So based on the search terms that you have entered, the most relevant results based on those terms are going to pre-populate up to the top. And as we scroll through here, we see that there's a basic schematic for how statutes are passed. As a general rule, Congress passes statutes and they'll start with findings and purpose. Why Congress felt like this was an area of law that was important to be legislated. After that, you'll generally find definitions, and there's usually at least one section. Sometimes there are two sections on definitions, and that kind of lays out exactly what different terms mean within that whole statutory schematic. After that, you'll get the meat and potatoes and some other things that come into play. For our purposes, we are going to go ahead and jump directly into the statutes section dealing with definitions, because a big part of our research assignment is what exactly is the definition of a reasonable accommodation. So we're going to open up that statute and we get the actual language of the act. From here, we would just read through there, looking at the different definitions and specifically looking for reasonable accommodations. Now we could scroll through here and we could get to part 9, reasonable accommodation. The term reasonable accommodation may include, so on and so forth, and it's actually explaining to us what a reasonable accommodation is. Or we could also click search document. And by doing this, this allows us to make a really precise search within our document. So I'm going to say reasonable within 3 words of accommodation. And this is searching this page looking for any place where reasonable is within 3 words of accommodation. So reasonable accommodation, the accommodation was not reasonable, anything like that. And this is a great tool to use when you get a document like a statute that is really, really long, and you realize once you're in the document, you should have been a little more precise. So you can use additional terms, and you can also use additional connectors looking within that document. All right, another tool that we want to look at within this statute is some additional content. So we're going to use our go-to and jump down to the case notes. And the case notes provide us a topical breakdown of how different cases have applied this statute. And this is the big difference between the United States Code and the United States Code Service. So the United States Code is the actual official version of the United States Code. The language, the statute, is exactly the same, but the United States Code is not annotated. The United States Code Service, which is what you get on Lexis, language of the statute is exactly the same, but you also have this nice annotations developed by editors. More specifically, because we have entered those search terms of reasonable within 3 of accommodation, we're getting a listing, or kind of highlighting, if you will, where those terms appear. We could just jump through where all the places that it talks about it, but we see here on the topical breakdown, no reasonable accommodation, fact issue as to whether accommodation requested were reasonable. So let's go ahead and jump into number 60, because basically what we have here is a selection of cases that have applied this statute on the specific issue of, was the requested accommodation in fact reasonable? Which is in fact a huge question in our fact pattern. Was our potential client's requested accommodation reasonable? So we'll go ahead and read through these selected cases and get a nice little sampling of how the cases have applied this statute for this precise issue. The next thing that we want to look at before leaving the statute is research references and practice aids. And this is great for a couple of reasons. Number one, it gives you some really nice secondary sources linked in here. So this is another one of those reasons that when you have the statute, it's okay to start with the statute instead of the secondary source because you will automatically have really nice secondary sources linked into that statute. The next thing that's really important here is your regulations. We're going to talk a little bit more about regulations in just a second, but just know this is a great place to go ahead and get started on that regulatory research because these are regulations that are associated with this statute. All right, now before we leave this page, we want to look at a couple of other things. The first thing I want us to look at is under About This Document. It's called Topic Summary Reports. We're going to open these up and it will show all of the summary reports that are related to the statute we were looking at. We're specifically going to open up accommodation. And topic summary reports are fantastic because what they do is they take a single topic, a single issue, and lay out all the research for you. So this is a great place to get started, a wonderful jumping pad. So you have the definition, seminal cases, elements, statutes and rules, secondary sources, burden of proof, standard of review, basically everything you can need to get started. As a practical matter, in the real world, when Lexis actually costs money and you're no longer in school, these are always free as well. So always utilize these lovely topic summaries. The default is going to be U.S. federal. If, however, you want to find the Florida law on accommodation, you can always jump over to other jurisdictions and select Florida, and that would give you basically the same report, but specifically for Florida law. All right, so we're going to back up and go back to our statutes and do one last step. Anytime you rely upon any authority, be it a statute, a case, a regulation, always, always, always shepherdize that authority. The shepherd signal is going to appear as a preview right here next to the statute. And this red stop sign or red exclamation point is really, really important. What that is telling us is there is some problem with this authority. And when we take a look at the shepherd's report, we can quickly see what that problem is by coming to analysis, warning, unconstitutional by. So here we see that at least one case has ruled some part of this statute unconstitutional. So we're going to click on that analysis and take a look at that case. From here, what we have to do is actually jump directly into the opinion, and we'll go to the Penn site that talks about the constitutionality of this statute and just kind of read around what it has to say. After reviewing the relevant precedent and considering the Kassenbach factors, the court concludes that the ADA and the Rehabilitation Act accommodation provisions, at least insofar as accommodation is defined, are not a valid exercise of Congress's enforcement power under the 14th Amendment. Congress has not legally abrogated the sovereign immunity of the states from suit by private persons brought under the ADA, so on and so forth. So this is letting us know that this specific issue, as it pertains to the ADA, has in fact been ruled unconstitutional. From there, we need to do some additional research to see exactly how the courts have followed that, noting, of course, that this is a Sixth Circuit District Court opinion. All right, so that is validation checking, ensuring our law is still good law. So once we have done that, made sure our law is still good law, we're going to shepherdize for the second reason. And the second reason we shepherdize is to expand our analysis, making sure that we have the most contemporary word from the highest court, making sure we're finding all of the cases that are the most factually specific to us. And we're going to do that by using this same part of the Shepherd's report to make it as relevant and pertinent to us as possible. So the first filter that we're going to apply is coming over here and selecting our court. And we're going to say the Second Circuit. Because if we're sitting in the Second Circuit, we really don't care all that much what the Sixth Circuit has to say. The next thing we're going to do is make sure we're having the most factually specific case law that we can. So under Search Within Results, we're simply going to type Asperger. And from there, we're going to run the search of Asperger. So what this is doing is taking all of the 812 cases in the Second Circuit and narrowing them down to those cases that have cited to this section of the ADA, the Americans with Disability Act, and have also dealt with Asperger's syndrome. And here we have really two cases, but it's actually kind of the same case. We have the case at the district court level, and then we also have the opinion that was appealed to the Court of Appeal level as well. So from here, we go ahead and jump into the opinion and take a look at what it has to say. Another thing that's really important to take a look at is the Shepard signal. So the Shepard signal, much like we looked at with case law, tells us whether there's any negative analysis, or if you see this green exclamation point, that lets you know that the Krasner opinion only has positive analysis. So not only has this opinion not been overruled or been ruled invalid in some way, shape, form, or fashion, but other opinions have followed it. And you'll know that by looking at that green exclamation point. We're going to take a short pause right here, and then I am going to record the second part of this video. Stay tuned. We are going to go ahead and start part 2 of our video. So where we left off, we were still at the Shepard's report, and we were looking for additional case law that expanded our analysis by using the Shepard's report. Now there is a third tab on the Shepard's report called Other Citing Sources that is often underutilized. And we're going to go ahead and jump into that and take a look at a couple of different things. Other citing sources is basically everything that isn't a case that cites back to the authority, in our case, this statute. So if you look here, you'll have court documents, law reviews and treatises, statutes, whole bunch of different material. Court documents are your briefs, pleadings, and motions. So your brief, of course, is much like you'll work on definitely in law school, but also in practice. The appellate process, your brief kind of fleshes out your argument. Law reviews and treatises, of course, are secondary sources. This is yet another reason when you're working from a statute, you don't necessarily need to start with secondary sources because you can always shepardize the statute and get all of those secondary sources that cite back to it. And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly, you have statutes. Now, statutes is a bit of a misnomer because it's called statutes, but really it's statutes, it's constitutional sections, and for our purposes, it's regulations. So this is another really, really great way to go ahead and get started with that administrative research, looking at those regulations that have cited back to this statute. So you're basically going to get all of the regulations that are found to be relevant to this particular section. Let me back up since I've kind of hung the system up. There we go, there's our regulations. And we can flesh them out this way and jump into the regulations. We're going to clear this statute limiter off right now and jump into our law reviews because this is one of the questions on the quiz. So we're going to jump into the law reviews, and from here we're going to apply a couple of different filters. The first one that we're going to use is our terms or our search within results. So we know we want something talking about Asperger's, but we also want to talk about and reasonable accommodation. So by saying Asperger's and reasonable accommodation, it's taking the results list that we're looking at, all those law review articles that cite back to this statute, and saying I only want to look at those that necessarily include both Asperger's and reasonable accommodation. From here we have 13 results, which is not too many, but you could use the timeline histogram to narrow it down even further. So if you only wanted to look at the results from the past couple of years, bring it down to 2013, and it will narrow down your results to a smaller list, starting first with 2013. And then we could jump into just whatever section or whichever law review looked relevant and on point. Okay, let's go ahead and clear that off, and we are going to move on back to our original search results. And a great way to get back to your original search is just to come over here to history, and that very top result under searches is going to be the actual last search that you ran. So Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. By clicking that, it's going to rerun the search so you're back to your original search results. We started with statutes and legislation, but now we're going to move into administrative codes and regulations. Now, administrative codes and regulations begins the regulatory research process. So quick overview on administrative law. Congress passes statutes, and within that framework of the statute, so within the Americans with Disability Act, you'll have the findings and purpose, the definitions, the meat and potatoes of the act. But if you keep going down looking at those statutes, you'll find a section or a statute that's titled regulations or rulemaking. And that section is basically Congress saying, we give rulemaking authority to this agency. That agency then has the authority and ability to promulgate regulations. Regulations are binding primary law. Not only that, they tend to flesh out the more specific parts of the law. So for instance, if a statute says you cannot cross the road, that's kind of bare bones, then they'll give rulemaking authority to the agency, and the agency will promulgate regulations that explain that law even more. So for instance, the regulation may say the road is considered a parking lot. The road is considered a thoroughfare. Just kind of fleshing out and being more specific. The reason this is important is A, regulations are the law as well, but B, when you're doing really difficult research, something very nitty gritty, a lot of times it ends up being a regulation that is the answer to your question rather than just a statute, which doesn't always tend to be as specific. Okay, so kind of overview on administrative law. Now on Lexis, we come to administrative codes and regulations to get to those regulations. What we would do is come over first to category and narrow down accordingly. So we're getting all of our federal regulations popping up here at the top, so there's really no need for us to apply the filters, but I do want to tell you the differences in them. Administrative codes are your actual codified past regulations. In the federal law, these are your CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations. They're codified topically, so much like statutes, they're broken down by topic, laid out really nicely and searchable exactly like statutes. Registers, however, is the Federal Register, and that is final regulations, proposed regulations, congressional comment, presidential orders. It's published every day, so it's a lot more current than the CFR, which is published, I believe, twice a year, but it's also really difficult to research in. So I actually recommend always starting with the CFR, so limiting to administrative codes, and then if you're feeling really ambitious, then go ahead and jump into the Federal Register and see if anything new has happened in the past 6 months. The next filter that's normally important to apply is selecting your jurisdiction. If we were looking at Tennessee law, we would want to look at the Tennessee regulations, but we're not, we're looking at federal, so we would want to narrow it down to federal. All right, so here we have some nice regulations. We're going to use the headings to guide our research from here. We could also enter additional search terms to change the relevance algorithm, but as we peruse through here, I think we can see some pretty good sections dealing with our regulations. So let's see. So this is a pretty good one, not making reasonable accommodation. Let's see, existing facilities. Let's just go ahead and jump into not making a reasonable accommodation. I think that sounds the most relevant. So when we jump into this regulation, what we're seeing is basically the rule of law that the agency passed, specifically as to what is not making a reasonable accommodation. We, much like with the statute, would read the actual language because this is our binding law, but also like the statute, we have annotations below. So we could jump into the annotations, and this is basically other cases, how cases have applied this regulation broken down topically for us. So just like we saw with the statute. Another important thing is statutory authority. And the statutory authority is showing you the actual statute that gave this agency the authority to promulgate this regulation. So this is just letting you know this regulation is in fact proper because the proper authority was given in order to promulgate it. All right, and of course, remember, we want to shepherdize this as well because we want to shepherdize all of the authority that we rely upon. All right, now we're going to back out and we are going to look at the second part of the administrative puzzle, which is administrative materials. So much like Congress in the statute gives these agencies the authority or rulemaking authority, the authority to make regulations, they also give them adjudicatory authority, which is basically the authority to make different rulings. So someone can come to the agency and file a grievance, and then the agency can rule upon that grievance, and the ruling would be administrative material. Other administrative material includes guidance from the agency and additional documentation from the agency created to aid the researcher, aid the attorney, aid people in understanding what the agency expects and what they believe the law to be. From here, the really important filters are first agency, because all of this administrative material is everything in the whole great wide world based on our search terms in every agency. But we only care about the agency that we're working under. In our case, the EEOC. So we'll go ahead and narrow it down to the EEOC. So we're only looking at that agency's material. From here, we could also narrow down by sources, but there's no need for us to do that because I'm getting some pretty good sources up at the top. And that's enforcement guidance, reasonable accommodation, and undue hardship under the Americans with Disability Act. So we're going to go ahead and open up that source. And by opening up that source, we have some really nice documentation and guidance from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission on what exactly an undue burden or undue hardship is. When is a reasonable accommodation a reasonable accommodation? And when does that become an undue hardship on the employer? So we'd want to use this in determining whether our potential client's request was in fact reasonable or an undue hardship on the university. All right, so let's go ahead and back out of this. And the very last thing we're going to look at today is cases. And we've already gotten a really good jump start on our research, specifically our case law research. First, we looked at those annotations within the statute. Next, we looked at the Shepherd's report for the statute, which included every case that cited back to that statute. We then narrowed it down to Asperger's. We also got some research on our case law by looking at our regulation, both the annotations and the Shepherd's report there. So this is just kind of rounding it out, making sure you've grabbed every potential case that's helpful to your client. So we're going to come over to cases, and then we're going to apply some additional filters that are going to be really helpful for us. The first one that we're going to apply is court. Again, it doesn't matter what the Fifth Circuit has to say if we're in the Sixth Circuit. Now, if there's nothing in the Sixth Circuit, then we'll, of course, consult our sister circuits. But as a default, start with a jurisdiction you're in. So we will narrow down to the Sixth Circuit. You could also select multiple and make sure you have the Supreme Court and the Sixth Circuit opinions. But to keep it really simple, I'm just going to narrow down to the Sixth Circuit. The next filter that we're going to apply is search within results. So that's going to take all 3,500 cases, almost 3,500 cases, and narrow them down with our specific factual scenario in mind. So I'm going to say Asperger and failure to accommodate. And this is going to take those cases, looking only for the cases that mention failure to accommodate and Asperger's. And this brings our results list down to just 6. Not only does it bring us down to 6, but it brings us down to some really meaningful results. 6 really great cases because they're factually on point, they're in the right jurisdiction, they're on topic, and you can also see the dates they're passed. So we've got some pretty relevant case law that we can dig into on this particular point. Once we're here, we're going to jump into the actual opinion and take a look at a couple of really important things. The first thing that I want to point out is that you have the Shepherd signal over to the right. So the Shepherd signal, of course, is letting you know caution, potential problematic analysis. They follow pretty much stop sign signals. So red means there's a problem for validation purposes. Yellow means possibly, but don't get too hung up on that. And if it's green or if it's blue, there is no negative analysis. Specifically, if it's green, other opinions have followed that. So keep that one in your back mind. You also have about this document, which has a legal issue trail that we'll talk about later in the at a later time as well. All right, let me grab one other opinion. Oh, this is the one I was looking for. Grab this one and show you a couple of other really quick things. First is your case summary. Your case summary is a nice little breakdown of the law, so this is kind of what the case is about. Right below that, you're going to have the headnotes. The headnotes are the points of law of the case. So this is everything the court ruled upon, the verbatim language of the case. If you actually want to see where that came from, use the drop down and it will take you to that portion of the opinion. This is the actual language that you'll also find in the headnote. Highlight it, copy advanced, make sure that you have standard selected and applied, and that will give you the Blue Book citation. Thanks so much.